Okay, guys, we need to talk about the first two core beliefs, foundational concepts related to this very interesting helping approach, a cousin to behavior theory called cognitive behavior theory. As we mentioned in the last video, at the very start of this module, and as you see in your lecture notes, this helping approach, very widely used today, very popular today, was developed by a man named Albert Ellis from his own experiences. He kind of developed this helping approach many years ago from his own personal experiences, where he realized that even in his own life, that his mind had tape recorded. That's the analogy, the metaphor that he often used that we associate with CBT. Oftentimes, is that oftentimes in our mind, he realizes that in his own life, our mind tape records certain messages that we've received in childhood, especially not just in childhood, but in childhood especially. And then what happens is we play those recordings over and over again in our mind. And unfortunately, many of those messages are negative or pessimistic or unrealistic. And what happens is we play them over in our mind so much we begin to accept them as real, even though they're not real beliefs that are not necessarily healthy or realistic. We'll talk more about that in our next module as far as some common examples of some unhealthy thinking, unhealthy beliefs. And that unfortunately, then too, those negative belief systems then influence our feelings and our behavior, often in negative, unhealthy ways. And that negative thinking system, that tendency for negative thinking, is really what's at the core of most of our problems. That's kind of the core kind of foundation that CBT is built on. And so, as we did in the modules 1 and 2 with behavior theory, and as I do with all of the theories that I cover in a theories class like this one, I always try to boil it down to just some core beliefs of what does this theory believe or say. So I think there really are four foundational beliefs to cognitive behavior theory. You can't really understand or appreciate or use CBT unless you understand these four beliefs. Number one, we are always talking to ourselves. Number two, the A, the B, the C. Number three, our unhealthy tendency. And number four, the issue of changing how we talk to ourselves or cognitive restructuring. Now, ideas number 3 and 4, our unhealthy tendency and cognitive restructuring, we're going to cover in the next module. So for this module, let's just review, as I've already outlined for you in both the PowerPoint and the lecture notes. Let me review for you core idea number 1 and number 2 really quickly. So here's core idea number 1. Notice that this theory is called cognitive behavior theory. Starts with the word cognitive. So that tells you right there that this is a theory that places an emphasis on what is called cognition or cognitive behavior. Well, what is cognition? Well, cognition is just our thoughts. It's our beliefs. We might also, too, use the word perception. We sometimes use the word attitude. We sometimes use the word self-talk. You also might use the word conscious. It's that voice inside my head talking to myself, right? So this theory, the first core idea is that we are always talking to ourselves. We are always engaged in cognitive behavior. Now, again, there's a lot of other words we could put in there in place of cognitive behavior. We could say we're always thinking to ourselves. We're always talking to ourselves. We're always believing. We're always perceiving. We always have a conversation going in our head. So this theory, sort of like behavior theory, emphasized that outward behavior is always happening. The first kind of idea that Ellis gave to us many years ago with CBT is that every single one of us is always talking to ourselves. Well, what are we talking to ourselves about? Well, we're talking to ourselves about what's going on around us. We're telling ourselves things about ourselves, the world, people around us, our options, whatever. We're making decisions all the time. We're making perceptions all the time. Even though it may feel like our mind is blank, our mind is barely ever blank. We're almost always talking to ourselves. As long as we're awake and active and alert, our mind is engaged. That's our brain's default setting. According to this theory, our brain or our mind's default setting is it's always turned on. We're always actively engaged in cognitive behavior. It's always happening. Now, here's kind of the key thing with cognitive behavior and the fact that we're always talking to ourselves. We don't always realize that we're talking to ourselves. It's there, but we're not always aware that it's there. Have you ever said to someone, if someone ever asked you, well, what were you thinking? Have you ever said, well, that's the problem. I wasn't thinking anything. Sometimes I've had clients before where I've said to them, so what was kind of going through your mind at that point? What were you thinking? And I've had clients before say, well, Glenn, that's the problem. I don't think. I wasn't thinking. Well, that's not necessarily always true. This theory teaches that there's always some kind of thought process or perception or thinking, thought patterns, self-talk going on in our head. Even though we may not realize it, we're always talking to ourselves. So why don't we sometimes, why is it often that we don't realize that we're talking to ourselves? Well, the two cues, here are the two cues I give you in your lecture notes that talk about why we don't always hear what we're saying to ourselves. Number one, our self talk or our beliefs or our thinking is often quiet or silent. It's there, but we don't realize it's there. Now, one of the reasons why we don't realize it's there is because we're always engaged in it. We just stop listening for it. And so some of you have been with me some of you have been with me. And you may remember in previous modules the desensitization idea. This idea of desensitization. You remember the concept and the definition of desensitization is the idea that anything that we're around consistently we become desensitized to, right? And so because we become desensitized to it, we stop noticing it. Well, anything that we are around consistently, we just stop noticing. It's just the way our brain works. Our brain filters out stuff that we are used to, and it only notices things that are kind of new. Well, if we're always talking to ourselves, then one of the potential, I won't say a danger, but one of the potential issues is that we oftentimes stop noticing it. It's always there, but it's quiet. The example that I use oftentimes is many, many years ago when my wife and I were dating. My wife's grandparents lived in a small town here in Texas. She was very, very close to her grandparents. And they lived in a small, what we used to call a shotgun shack, a very, very small 2-bedroom house. And the front of the house was across the street from a railroad track. And when she and I were dating, we were not even married yet. We traveled for the first time to that small town to spend 2 nights with them. And we got there during the daytime, and her grandmother said, "Well, Glenn, you're going to sleep up here in the front bedroom." And I said, "That's fine." It's a nice little house, gave me a bedroom. And about 2 hours after we got there, the house began to rattle and shake as a train went by, and the horn was blowing loud. I mean, the house was just rattling and shaking. And I thought, whoa, I mean, I mean, this house is close to that railroad track, right? Well, I didn't even think about the middle of the night at that point. I laid down that night, and about 2:30 in the morning, I'm laying there in bed, and I thought an earthquake was happening. That house started shaking and rattling, and here came a train going down the train tracks at 2:30 in the morning, blowing its horn. And it woke me up, and it scared me to death. That whole house was shaking and rattling. That thing went by. It felt like it went by for 10 or 15 minutes. It probably wasn't that long. But that train rambled and rambled and rambled, and I sat there just the whole house, the house shaking and rattling, and it went on down the railroad tracks. And as it got kind of quiet, I could hear in the other room, I could hear my wife's grandfather snoring. He was sound asleep. He had lived in that house for 50 years, and it didn't even wake him up. And I thought that was kind of interesting, right? So I laid there, went back to sleep. Well, about 6:30 in the morning, here came another train going the other direction. It woke me up, got me out of bed, right? And it went by and got kind of quiet. I could hear him snoring in the room next door. He didn't even wake up. And I got up the next morning. They said, "Hey, did you sleep okay?" And I said, "Yeah, I got the two trains woke me up." And both my wife's grandmother and grandfather said, "What trains?" I said, "Well, the one that came through at 2:30, one that came through at 6:30." And they said this, "We don't even hear them anymore. We've lived here for so long that we don't even hear them anymore." Well, here's the thing. I guarantee you that from a physical standpoint, every time a train went by, their brain heard it, but it didn't register, right? Their mind was desensitized. So in other words, it did not wake them up because their mind was so used to it, it just blocked it out, right? And the longer I came and visited in that house, after my wife and I married, we came a few times. After 4 or 5 or 6 years of sleeping in that front bedroom, I got to where, guess what? I slept through the trains. And it wasn't because I did not hear them. Well, my ears heard them, but my mind and my brain didn't, we would say, because it just blocked it out. It was there, but it wasn't registering in our mind. That's what happens with our self-talk. We're so used to it, we just don't hear it anymore. Now we can hear. We'll talk more about that in the next module. We can learn to start listening for how we're talking to ourselves, but oftentimes it's just quiet. It's silent. And so we don't hear it anymore. That's one of the things that kind of comes into play is the idea of desensitization. Cognitive, we would say, desensitization when it comes to our self-talk. So that's the first cue. The second cue is the word quick. So we don't hear our self-talk because of quiet and quick. Well, what does quick mean? Quick just means that the way our brain is wired, it works really fast. And all of our thoughts are in our mind or in our brain. So because our brain is like a big supercomputer that works super, super, super like a millisecond fast, right? What happens then is our thinking is very, very quick. And so because it's quick, we don't even notice it, right? It happens so fast, we don't even notice it. We don't have to put a lot of conscious awareness into our self-talk. The example, maybe some of you have been with me in my theories class and you've heard me use this example. If you were at your house one day and you were going to work, you went out to go to work, and as you came around the back of your car, the side of your car, your eye noticed that one of your tires was flat. Maybe you've had that. I've had that experience for the years many times. So you come out of your house, you notice kind of out of the corner of your eye that one of your tires is flat. Well, here's what doesn't happen. This is not what happens. You don't stand there and you don't say to yourself, what do I think about this? Let me decide. I'm running late. I don't have money to fix this flat. Okay, here I'm deciding this is a bad thing. Okay, this is a bad thing. Now I'm upset. That's not how it works, right? That's not how our mind works. When you come out and the first millisecond you get a glimpse of your tire being flat, your brain begins to make sense of it and begins to decide whether that's good or bad. And my brain's the same way. It doesn't take conscious effort where you have to say, well, hang on, what do I think about? Okay, this is not good. No, immediately. That's immediately, quickly, our mind decides and makes sense of things around us. It's kind of a survival technique, I think, as far as just our mind, right? And so our self-talk, our thinking, our perception, our cognitive behavior, it happens really, really fast. And so because it happens so fast, we don't notice it. We don't notice it because it's quiet. We don't notice it because it's so quick. So those two cues kind of come into play when it comes to why we don't notice our self-talk, even though it's there, because this is under the umbrella of that first core idea that we're always talking to ourselves. And so one of the reasons why we don't always realize that is because of those two cues. That's first core idea number one. We're always talking to ourselves. You ever driven down the road and looked at someone next to you in the car next to you? They're having some deep, intense conversation. Maybe they're on speakerphone with someone, or maybe they were talking to themselves, right? They were having a conversation out loud with themselves. Well, we all talk to ourselves. This theory says, well, all of us talk to ourselves. Core idea number one. Core idea number two, here it is. And it is an idea that Ellis borrowed from behavior theory, because you may remember back from module number one, ABC, antecedent, behavior, consequence. Well, when Ellis began to kind of study behavior theory and compare it to his beliefs and what he was finding about cognitive behavior, he began to realize that the A, the B, and the C applied to our cognitive behavior, but he put a couple little twists on it. So A, B, C. A, activating event. B, beliefs. C, emotional and behavioral consequences. So that's the new ABC. So for this module, here is CBT's ABC. It's the new ABC. Activating event, beliefs, emotional and behavioral consequences. Let's talk about A and B. A is activating event. A is just like an antecedent. Ellis chose the word activating event because it was just a little bit made a little bit more sense to clients than if you were to use the word antecedent. If you were in counseling today and you were sort of trying to use CBT to help someone, and you were to use the word antecedent, they might say, "What is that?" But they know what the word activating event is. An activating event's a trigger. It's something that happens around us. It could be the behavior of another person. It could be coming out and finding my tire flat. It could be being hungry. So it's an antecedent. It is something happening around us. Something happens around us or to us. That's A. Now, what happens as a result of that? Well, B happens. And activating event happens first. And then B is beliefs. So Ellis believed that we are always talking to ourselves, that's B, about what's happening around us, that's A. So as life is happening to me, things are happening to me, I'm having a constant conversation in my mind about what's happening around me. Activating event results in or produces beliefs. So again, kind of this idea, just as we talked about before in module number one, with the traditional ABC, the idea that our behavior just doesn't come out of nowhere. Our behavior is often in response to an antecedent. Well, cognitive behavior theory says kind of the same thing about our thinking. Our thinking, our thoughts, our beliefs, our self-talk is almost always in connection to, driven by, caused by, so to speak, stuff happening around us. So it's often important to understand. One of the ways we can understand our self-talk is to understand, well, why was I talking to myself that way? What was going on around me? What was the activating event or the events? That might help me understand why I'm thinking like I am, is to understand, well, what's going on around me? So activating event beliefs. With this new ABC, B does not stand for behavior per se. It stands for beliefs. B is beliefs. We again, under B or around B, here are some other words we could use. Cognition or cognitive behavior, thoughts or thinking, self-talk, perception, attitude, conscious or whatever. That voice inside my head, all of that is B, because all of that is the same thing as beliefs. Activating event and then beliefs. And then after we've talked to ourselves, well, something happens next. Ellis was a believer. This theory says that because our thinking is basically a form of human behavior, guess what behavior results in? Consequences. So when I believe or talk to myself, that's B, my thinking produces consequences. Well, what kinds of consequences? Well, this is a key idea. This comes with C. This theory teaches us that the two main consequences that our thinking or our beliefs produce are feelings and outward behavior, emotional and behavioral consequences. Think something, feel something, do something. I'm going to say that again. This theory sort of teaches that the order in which we are wired is we believe something first, think something, feel something, do something. So this is a key idea. This was sort of a unique idea when CBT was first created. The idea that our emotions or our feelings are usually just the result of our thinking, a consequence of our thinking. Have you ever had someone who ever said to you, I don't know why I'm feeling like that? I've had lots of clients through the years say, I don't know why I'm feeling emotionally like that. Well, if you and I use CBT in our work with our clients, we would say, well, the reason why we feel anything is because of a belief, a thought, a belief system. Our beliefs produce our feelings. And our feelings often then produce or often influence or oftentimes, kind of cause our behavior. Think something or believe something, feel something, do something. So this idea that our beliefs, that's B, produces consequences. What kinds of consequences? Emotional and behavioral consequences. And so it's not just any consequence, real specific here. You may remember back in our first module when we talked about A, B, the traditional ABC, I gave you several, 4 or 5 or 6 different categories of consequences from behavior theory. Well, from a CBT perspective, there's really just 2 types of consequences that our beliefs or our thinking produce: feelings and behavior, emotional and behavioral consequences. Unique idea. So again, one of the key ideas with CBT is just one way of kind of looking at human behavior and human emotions is this idea, this core idea: beliefs come first. Beliefs come first. Whenever I teach this theory in the counseling theories class, if some of you have had me before for counseling theories, or you're in there with me right now, whenever I teach that class in the classroom, one of the first things I say about this theory is that this theory believes beliefs come first. Feelings don't come first. Behavior does not come first. Feelings and behavior are just outflows of, they're symptoms of, they're consequences of what we're thinking in our head. Beliefs come first. Another way of saying it is beliefs influence behavior. Beliefs influence behavior. So A is activating event, something happens around me. I'm talking to myself and giving meaning to what that activating event is. That's B. Activating event, then beliefs, then my beliefs produce emotional and behavioral consequences. So it's still the same kind of general idea, sort of, from the original behavior mod ABC with a little bit of a twist on the B and the C. A is basically the same. It's just got a different name, activating event, antecedent, kind of the same thing. The B and the C is really where there's the difference in this new second version of A, B, and C. So those are the first 2 core ideas of this theory. I want you to go and look at your lecture notes in this module. I want you to look at your PowerPoint presentation. I want you to get ready to do your homework. You're going to have a case study to do in the next module, not in this module, but in module number 6. First core idea is we are always talking to ourselves. And again, the word talking means beliefs, thinking, thoughts, cognition, self-talk. Sometimes we don't always hear that because of the two Q's. Our thinking is often quiet and quick. Second core idea is ABC, activating event, beliefs, emotional and behavioral consequences. All right, so those first two core ideas. Next module, we're going to talk about core idea number 3, our unhealthy tendency, and core idea number 4, cognitive restructuring. That'll be next module. Have a great couple of weeks, and I will see you in the next module. Have a good one.